In this video, we're going to be building on some of the things we've done before. In the last video, I think we did provider. We won't be using that, but we'll be using what we learned about React-Redux and hooking components up, and we're going to be building on what we did in terms of input values and how those flow through, and we'll be building all of that, using all of that to build this. And so this is a repo search tool to go search the GitHub API for something like monitor. And so this is any repo that has the word monitor in it, or possibly in its description or something like that. And so this does Ajax. And so our main discussion this time will be about how you can fit Ajax into a basic React-Redux application. Now, we're going to get there without going through some of the things that you might think you have to go through to do Ajax, like middleware, async actions, things like that. There's actually easier ways, arguably maybe not better ways, but easier ways to get started with Ajax. And so that's what we're going to be doing this time, learning how to do this, to be able to put in info like so, hit enter, and do an Ajax call to go get data and then render that in our component. So that's our goal for today. Okay, let's build it. So I have here my source code and an app created with Create React App once again. So this has already got me started with a basic React Webpack setup. That's what I've been doing in all my Redux videos. So that's where we're at with this. So let's go ahead and start by installing what we need that Create React App doesn't give us. So I need Redux and I need React-Redux. Later on, whenever I do Axios, I will just install that at that point. So here we go. Redux, React-Redux. Let's save it. And I think that should be all we need for a little while. Everything is installed. I've restarted my app. We should be good to go. So we are going to code this thing from scratch. Every little bit of it. Some of this will be just review, and I think that's okay. If you want to skip ahead, I don't know at this point how many minutes it'll take us to get there, but skip ahead some minutes if you want to just jump to the Ajax bits. But just in case you want a little review, let's just go ahead and start building things piece by piece. Let's start with our store. And so we're going to create our folder as we have been doing and define what needs to be in here. So let's see. We're going to start with some initial state. And for our GitHub repo browser, what we need is a couple things. First of all, we're going to need the repos themselves whenever they come back. So we'll get an array of repos. And we're going to need a input value and so that's for the input that you saw before. We're going to need to store that input value in state. So search input value, and this will be a string. And so this should be all we need in terms of state. So let's go ahead and create our reducer. We're going to say state and start it off with the initial state that we got up there, and then action. As we have been doing, I will console log when the reducer fires, and then return the state. That's a good place to start. Next, I want to create a store from this. So I need to import create store from Redux. There we go. That should be all we need to do with the store until we start actually sending actions. So let's see, if we go to app.js, now in the last video we did a provider, and so we don't really need that in this case. I'm just going to create one component, so we don't need to import it. We can just put the store as state into the component. So input store equals, from. Makes more sense. Okay, so this will give us our store, which we just exported here. And now we need to create another component. So let's give it call it repo search. Let's start with a pure functional component and see if that'll work for us. Switch this to JSX. There we go. Okay, so we have our repo search. Let's just put a header in here. Let's get this hooked up. Now I'm going to need to import React. We don't, we'll get an error. And I will just go ahead and export default repo search. Let's get this in here. We don't need any of this stuff, including this logo. So let's import repo search from repo search and put it in right here. Okay, there's our component. Excellent. Nothing new so far. We haven't even used any React-Redux. We've used Redux to define our store, and we've done regular React to create our component. Now let's hook our Redux up to our React component with React-Redux. So that means here we need to pass in the store. And so that will go into there. And then in repo search, we need to not export this at all. What we want to do is we want to, first of all, import a function called connect from React-Redux. And what we're doing, as we have been doing, is we call this connect function. We're going to pass in two other functions, the map props state to props and the map dispatch to props here in a second. And then we pass in the component here, and this wraps our component with the React-Redux stuff, and that's how that connection happens. So let's just see if that works. And just for grins, let's open this up. Okay, so we can see my reducer fired. Nothing seems awry at this point. Let's just move forward. So in theory, if we think about our store, right, we have this search value. Let's go ahead and put a default in there. Let's create a function called map state to props. Also review. And so I have this function. I'm going to return the input value from state. And so in state, I called it search input value. Here, I can keep that same name. I can rename it to something shorter. Doesn't matter. It's totally fine. That's what this does. This maps state to props. And so I'm going to need to pass that in there. So let's think a little bit more about our component. We are going to need an input, and we are going to need a list. This list will have a list of repos, like so. And so our styling is not going to be particularly fancy at this point. We can just see list items in an unordered list. But that should be working. Now let's go ahead and get this value populated here. So value equals props.inputValue. So there we go. There's our default value. Now we get a warning at this point because we have specified a value but not an onChange. We're going to do that here in a moment. All right, let's see. What do we need to do? Well, let's go ahead and do that. That now is a good time for that. Map dispatch to props. Here's our second function. Now this dispatch is the dispatch. This is how we dispatch actions to the store. And so I'm gonna call this handle input change. And let's see, console log handle input change happening. Now that we've created this, we need to not forget to put that right down in there. And so now we're passing in map state to props and map dispatch to props. And then finally, the component itself. So we called it handle input change, and so we should go here and say onChange equals this, not this, props dot handle input change. All right, let's see if we see that console log. We do. Now my input never changes, and the reason why my input never changes is the input is based on the state in my Redux store via this bit right here. And so for my input to actually change, I need to change the state in the store. But hey, I'm set up just fine for doing that here. And so let's dispatch an action. Let's think about the action first from the store's perspective. From the store's perspective, I need in here to handle this action. So let's do a switch on the actions type. And so I need to come up with some sort of name. And so call it whatever, like input, or since I have search input value here, search input change, right? And let's see, return object.assign. And now we're going to overwrite only this search input value, not the array, just the search input value. And that is going to come from, where's this value going to come from? It's going to come from the action. So the action has to tell us what the new input value is going to be. So action.value. And I'll just need to create a property called value. It doesn't have to be value, it can be anything. And just so we can get a warning to fix it, expected to default case for this right here, so we'll go do that now. That should get rid of our warnings. Okay. Now, if we send an action with search input change and then put a value in the action, it should update the state. So let's see. Dispatch type, there it is, and then we need to get the value. And the reason why I put this here is because I want access to the input itself so that I can do evt.target.value. Okay, our reducer is firing every time we type, and our input is changing. Fantastic. Now, quick review. Where does this EVT come from? Well, it's not magic. Whenever you have an input, this is the same as it is with regular DOM programming. If you add a listener to an input for when things are changed, like key up, key down, whatever, anytime you do that, whenever it fires the function, it's going to pass in an event object, which has information about the event. And one of those important pieces of information is the target. And so here in React, they're creating a slightly different setup. They actually take over the events and do some special things, but they maintain this. in that they always pass this target in the event object. And so we can get the value of that DOM element here. And so how does that event object get in there? Well, what we're doing here is we are just specifying the function to call whenever change happens. We're not calling it here. We're passing the function to call. And so therefore, whenever it calls it, it will pass in as the first argument the event object. So that's how that's getting there. React is doing it for us. Okay, so now search input change is working. Let's get rid of our default value because that's not great. So if we want to type in stuff, we got it. Next thing I want to support is I want to handle the enter key. Easy way of doing that would be to go over here to our repo search and wrap a form tag around the input. So here we have a form tag, and we need to have a submit function. Because whenever you enter, by default, it will submit this as a form. And so on submit, so I need to map a dispatch to props. Okay, so let's do it. Handle submit. And let's see, console.log submit. Now at this point, if I were to hit enter, actually I'll just go ahead and do it. Let's go ahead and put this in here. Okay, stuff, enter. Oh, all my input is gone, and I put a console log and it was gone too. That's because it's doing a full page post. So what we want to do is we want to stop that. We want to prevent that default behavior specifically. That's our wording. And so just like when a change event happens and it passes an event object into handle input change, when a submit event happens, it will pass an event object into submit. So I can go here and then I can say event.prevent default to prevent the default behavior. So now I see my console log for submit and my page is not refreshing. So this is what I want. So whenever we handle submit, what we need to do is at this point, we need to make an Ajax call. Okay, this is exciting. We are now a number of minutes into the video and now finally getting to the Ajax. So let's go ahead and think about how we would do that. Now often in Redux land, and if you go look at the Redux documentation, generally where they're going to seem to want to send you whenever you do Ajax calls is to want to send you down the middleware path in the asynchronous actions path. I'm not going to do that. I think that's a fine way to do it, I guess. But whenever you're first getting into Redux, question, is there an easier way to do it? And actually, yes, there is an easier way to do it in that we can actually do it right here without introducing any new concepts. And so that's what I want to do here. Assuming I continue on with these videos after the next few, which is my plan, but we'll see. Then I'll talk about asynchronous actions and things like that. But right now, in the spirit of let's build some stuff, some cool stuff, and you need Ajax to build lots of cool stuff in React, let's just do it right here. And later on, you can go down your next step of learning the potentially better but slightly more complicated way of doing this. So we're going to start with fetch, and I have a video watcher request to do Axios. I will do Axios in a minute. They're almost exactly the same if we go this direction. Actually, if you go the other direction, they're going to be, with the async actions and the middleware and all that, they're going to be almost the same then too. So let's just start with fetch. So at this point, if I want to fetch, I can just do it right here actually. Now let's go look and see what we're going to fetch. So I'm going to go to api.github.com and I need the repository search URL because I'm going to be searching for repositories. So I'm going to take this right here and bring this in. Now I'm not going to do paging right now. sorting, so I can get rid of all those. And all I need is this. And so I'm going to backtick this so that I can just put a $ right here and use template literals. So I'm going to need to query for something. Right now, let's not get it out of the state. Let's just create a variable called query, and let's search for something like stake. So we're going to look for repos that have names that include the word stake. I think it might even return repos that have users where their login names are stake, which is a pretty awesome login name. But anyway, this is what's going to go in here. So now let's see if we get any results. Let's see if this works. I mean, maybe it won't work at all. Hint, I think it's going to work, just so you know. Okay, so let's see if we get any data. All right, let's take it for a spin. At this point, it doesn't matter what I type in here because it's always just doing stake. So if I submit, notice first of all that the submit fired before we have the data. This right here fired before this did, even though this comes first in code. That's because these Ajax calls are asynchronous functions, and so it's not going to do what is called blocking before it runs this code. Whenever it does the fetch, it's going to put that Ajax call on the queue to be processed and then continue on. And so that's why we see the console log first. And then when the data comes back and we return it from the raw response to JSON, then later we get this. Now, it's not much later, but it is later. So that's why we saw that order there, because submit is right down here, right after the fetch, and the fetch is going to send off an asynchronous request. And so it won't block, it'll put the API call on the queue and continue on, and then later when the data comes back, it will then fire the thens. Okay, so do we get data? We've now covered the why this order is here. Let's talk about the data. Do we get data back? And the answer is yes. And so we're going to need this here in a second. So let's look at some of the values. So first of all, the data for the repos comes back in a property called items, and we get 30 at a time. The search found 277, but we got 30 at a time. And so these repos are called, given names. Most of them have stake in them. Proximate probably apparently has a username, perhaps related to stake. We can go look that up later. Let's see all those stakes. So this totally works. Here's our total count. There's 277 repos, just sending 30 at a time. It's cool. So we need to go in there, and in terms of the values, ID, that'll be useful for a key for our list items. And then name will be really good for the name. And what would be really great is if we made a link to the repository. Now usually, if you want a link to that data on GitHub's website, they'll give you this HTML URL. So that's what we're going to go for right there. So let's now work out doing something with that data. So we already have our, we can close that. We already have our store set up with repos. Let's go ahead and change the repos. And so if we're going to do that, then that means we need a new action type. We can call this whatever, set repos, load repos, whatever we want, I guess. I'm going to return object.assign, like so, as we have been doing. Now I'm going to set the repos to what was sent in the action. So I can call it whatever I want. I'll just call it repos as well. So if we send in an action called set repos, it will then set that in state. Now we already said that the array of repos is in a property called items, so we don't want to put just data here because that's not it. That's an object with stuff in it. We want the items themselves. And so that right there should set the items. So let's leave this here just in case we need to come back and look at the data. So now if there are repos, in theory, what we should be able to do is go up here and actually take advantage of that data. Actually, we can't yet because that data is in state. And before we can access it, we need to map it to props. There we go. Now we can use it. Props.repos.map. Okay, so map will run this function for every single item in the array. And so I'm going to return for each one a list item, and we'll use as a key that ID, and then let's just start with the repo name, like so. So we're still ignoring our input, we're doing our API call, and lo and behold, boom, these repos all show up. Cool. Let's do an anchor tag. And in here, we're going to set the repo.html URL. So now these should turn into links. And so if we want to go look at Proximate, we can go over here and see what he's got. I guess there's something related to steak somewhere in here. I mean, tenderloin is obviously steak related. Hey, Proximate. Ooh, description, steak and needles. There it is. That, I don't know what that is, but it's a thing. Okay. So steak repos, we have succeeded. And that's the basic idea of doing Ajax. You can do it right here in map dispatch to props. Now there are some negatives to this. First of all, this means this map dispatch to props is going to potentially get big. It'd be really cool if we could come up with a way of organizing it that doesn't add too much to our concept count. Also, if it's in here, this code is not going to be shareable with another component. And so being able to separate it out for that reason would be a good idea as well. So let's go ahead and do that. All right. And so I am going to create a file called API. And I'm not saying at all that this is the best way or this is the only way. This is just a way. And so I'm going to create a function here called getRepos. And I want to move all of this code right here, all this query code, into this other file. And let me repeat, this isn't required. If you're just getting started, then stop right here and just go with it and play around and make cool components. But if you do want another way of organizing things, right here. So we need to get everything into here to make all of these calls. Like there's no dispatch in here right now. Let's see. The query, we're currently hard coding, so we'll have to figure out how to get that in there in a second. So let's pass the dispatch in here. And so if we're going to have this file, so let's say export default. Let's export this as an object and get repos as a function in it. So if we go up here and import this thing, let's see what we get. API, oh hey look, it's an object with a function called getRepos. Cool. I kind of expected that. Okay, so here we go. Call dispatch. So in theory, then we can go in here and say get rid of all this stuff here and say API.getRepos and pass in the dispatch function. And now we've cleaned this up. This is now nice and tidy. See if everything still works. Everything still works. Why does it still work? I mean, we've now moved it out of the component. What is this crazy magic? Well, let's follow the flow. And so we do some typing, we hit enter, which makes the submit happen. We call get repos and pass in dispatch. So here's dispatch. We're making our API call, and when it's done, we are then dispatching an action like normal. All right. And so this dispatch will work no differently here than it will in the other location. And we're just dispatching an action. The action is dispatched with the data. And then, of course, going back to here, map state to props will fire again. And this time, it will actually have the repos in it. And so whether you put it here or you put it here, it actually doesn't matter. I tend to move things out when I'm just organizing code this way. I tend to move things out just so I don't clutter this up. And also this means this can be used from another location. All right. Now let's figure out how to put in the input value. I'm going to show you the easy way, okay? The low concept count way. That's what I'm trying to do with this video. Just how do you just start doing Ajax without having to know a lot more about Redux. That's the goal. So what would be awesome is I could pass in the query right here. So if that's the case, that means I have to have it here. Now where am I going to get it? Well, I can't get it from the props right here because I don't have access to these updated props right here. So what am I going to do? Well, one thing I could do is this. I can pass it in here. Now, if I'm going to pass it in here, that means I'm going to need to do this up here. So up, submit. I need to turn this into a function call. And so now, where do we get our AVT? Well, AVT comes from the event itself, the event firing. So that means that's actually going to be passed in there now. And I need to just pass that in. And now it works like it did before. The only difference is now I can say props.inputValue. So then now I can pass in let's pass in pants. Look at all those repos about pants. Or knife. Yes, or jQuery. Lots of jQuery. Okay. Now I've actually passed that value down. So let's follow the flow of that. So I'll start here in the code. So whenever the submit happens, it's going to fire this function right here. Now this arrow function will get the event object that React is sending. And so I have to then pass that down into our handle submit. Before I didn't have to because React was calling handle submit for us, and so therefore it was just always passing it. When I take this over, when I'm saying no, I'm supplying an arrow function for you right here, then I'm going to have to pass that through for it. So that goes in there, but I also have access to input value right here, which is cool. So now this fires with the event object and the input value. And let's see, here it is. Here's the event object, here's the input value. I'm just passing the dispatch. I use the event object to prevent default behavior, so it doesn't do a full form post. And then I pass in dispatch in the query. Now, if we want to use Axios, and I guess in here I use the query and then it makes the Ajax call as before. So that's the full flow. If I'm using Axios, it's very similar to this. So first, let me install it. Now, I'm not a normal user of Axios. I use fetch. And so let's go check this out. So we restarted the page, and it decided to open this up in a new tab for whatever reason. I don't know why. We don't need API to GitHub anymore, so let's do a search for Axios, shall we? Here's Axios. Now, what we don't want to do is don't want to click on this link. That's a news site. What we want is this link, because this will give us an example, because this is actually the repo for Axios itself. And so if we look at a basic example, it goes something like this. Now, if I want to, I can, instead of doing this, go the same exact route. I need to import Axios from Axios, and I think we can, at this point, dispatch with this console log. So now, there's that Axios I just imported. I need my URL, which is here. And so query is coming in here, just like we worked through before. And now, well, what can I do? Well, I need to, whenever I get data, with Axios, you don't seem to need this spot where you're turning the response into JSON. So let's just perform an action. And if I recall correctly, that's going to be in response.data.items. Let's go ahead and console log the Axios response so we can see what that looks like. But I think maybe this will work just as is. We'll find out soon enough. So I'm going to search for Barbie. And it seems to have worked. Well, let's look at the Axios response. It comes back with lots of things, but one of those things is the data itself. So here's the data. And at this point, we're looking at the API response from GitHub, just as we were doing before. So now, this is how you do Axios. How does it differ from using fetch? Not by a lot, at least on the basic, just on the basic thing right there. So that's the basic idea if you want to use Axios. And for Axios, if you want to separate that out into another file, well, it's very similar to what we just did there with the fetch. And we say apo.getRepos Axios. We pass in dispatch, and we pass in query. And we go here and we say function getRepos Axios dispatch query. Paste that. Here's our query. Here's our dispatch. And now we can export that. So I have now made a boo-boo. Axios is not defined. Well, that's because I imported Axios here and then moved the code. Shame on me. And so I've now moved that import there. And so now let's search for book. I like books. There's books. Fantastic. And we can see, ooh, Python guide. I like Python. Here's a Python book. Cool. All right. Those are the basic ideas of how to use fetch and how to use Axios and how you can, without all the middleware, async actions, all that jazz, do API calls. This may not be the best thing to do long term. I will entirely leave that up to you. But it is a way to get started. So if you're just looking for an easy way to get started with Ajax with this stuff, here you go. This is a good choice for you. I think it'll work, and it'll be a little bit easier to deal with than going the longer, more conceptually heavy route of middleware, at least at first. All right, so get started, get coding.